Anyway, what we've got to present here is a communications planning framework, and it's the one that I used and a number of people that work for me used in preparing for my communication. So to start with, this is it's based on an old model, but it's actually a fairly accurate model of how does communications actually work. This actually came out of the electronics communication field, but it's got these various features. You've got a source who's wanting to communicate to a receiver, and this all occurs within a context in which there's noise. The receiver's getting messages from all kinds of other sources besides you. There's presumably some overlap between the context of the source or the receiver. The object of the communication is to get a response from the receiver or feedback. And what tends to complicate this is that the source's message comes through a grid. The source's message is shaped by their vocabulary, their framework, their values, their conceptual framework. And the receiver's reception of that message and the feedback back from the message is shaped by the grid that the cultural, linguistic, vocabulary grid of the receiver. And what tends to complicate things is when the grid of the source is different than the grid of the receiver, which is very often the case. The politician's grid is different than the grid of those people sitting in the audience. The politician's grid is different than the media's grid. The whole challenge of cross-cultural communication is when oil companies communicate with Aboriginal people, when scientists communicate with non-scientists, when faith-oriented people communicate with non-faith-oriented people. Again, the whole challenge of cross-cultural communication. And then, of course, there's a media as well that is used to carry the message to the source. So it's with this model in mind that this framework is based. And I argue that there are source-oriented communicators. And source-oriented communicators are ones who start with, what do I want to say? And how do I want to say it? And what is my vocabulary? And what's my favorite media, et cetera, et cetera. It's source-oriented. And I'm not being negative on that. For peer-to-peer communications, that's fine. But I'd argue that a democratic politician is better to be a receiver-oriented communicator. And a receiver-oriented communicator does not start with what I want to say. It starts with, who are these people? What are their values? What are their interests? What are their concerns? Why are they here today? What is their vocabulary? What is their conceptual framework? What is their favorite media? How would they say to somebody else what I'm saying to them if they understood what I was saying? And eventually the receiver-oriented communicator is not that you're just there to tell them what they want to hear. That's not the point. You've got a message just like the source-oriented communicator, and you want to get through to them. But your starting point for figuring it out is at a different point. And this questionnaire is actually a questionnaire for a receiver-oriented communicator. And it just takes us through the different steps. And say starts with the audience. On the sheet that you've got, these are these questions elaborated on a little more fully than they are on the screen. And the first one is, who's the target of your communication? Exactly who is it you're speaking to? And for example, in a public meeting, there's often more than one target. There's your primary target, which may be the audience. But if the media are there, there's the media there as well. And often this is a bit of a dilemma. How do you speak to that target? And some political people are almost entirely talking to the media when they're talking to a public audience. And actually the public audience eventually gets that. This person's not talking to me. They're talking to the camera. We couldn't, if we weren't here, they wouldn't notice. One way of coping with that is to, and I used to do this at the front end of a public meeting, I'd say to the media guys, you don't want to hang around and hear all of this. So about 5 minutes in, I'm going to turn to you and I'm going to give you your 5 minutes or your 3 minutes or your 2 minutes of what you need to know about what I'm going to say tonight. If you want to hang around later, that's fine. And so I kind of specifically go to that target, and then the rest of my discourses to the folks that are in there. But who's the target, and specifying who your target is important. And then the second one is what do you know about the target? And the more you know about the target, the better. And this is where when I had people helping me with my communications, this is the most important thing they could do for me. Who are these people that I'm going to be talking to? What are their values? What are their interests? What's their background knowledge? Is there any current relationship between me and them? Have I met them before or talked to them before? Is there any common ground? Is there major differences? The bigger the differences, particularly if you get into cross-cultural communication, I suppose I'm speaking on behalf of an oil company to an Aboriginal band where the commonality is scarce. That's particularly where you want to search for analogies. Analogies are one of the best bridges in cross-cultural communication. Can I think of something that illustrates what I want to say, but it's in their context? So the more you know about the target, the better. That's why at some public meetings, going there early and talking to the people that you're going to be talking to informally before the meeting is not bad. You may find something out, particularly politically, if you're in a new area where you don't know. You thought what they were interested in was issue X, and you find out by being there early to know it was issue Y. Well, better to find out before the meeting rather than after the meeting, or before the conversation rather than after. What's the context, and this can be what's the context in time? Am I going to be speaking to these people on Thanksgiving? I'm going to be speaking at the beginning of the New Year's. There's something going on. Is it the night before the Grey Cup final or the Stanley Cup? Like knowing what the context is in time, and then what's the emotional context? What's the psychological context? Are these people angry? Are they asleep? Are they happy? Are they just again, the more you know about the context, the better. And then what's the competing messages and the noise? Like there's these studies on how many people get 2,000-3,000 discrete messages a day. Yours is just one of them. What is the noise? Has somebody else been talking to them about the thing you're talking about to them, filled their heads with some preconceived ideas? Again, the more that you can identify that stuff, the better. Sometimes if the noise is so distracting, there's some other position or some other view that's been, these people have been exposed to. You have to deal explicitly with that noise. You may have heard this, but let me tell you a little bit different perspective on it. Again, what's the most appropriate medium? And you might not have a choice on this, but again, there's a difference between a source-oriented communicator and receiver-oriented communicator. Maybe I'm comfortable with PowerPoint, but maybe you aren't. Well, then what are you comfortable with? That's what I should be using, not what I'm comfortable with. Again, this is all just sort of subsets of the more you know about your audience, the better. Okay, and then finally we get to, or not finally, but along the route we get to what's the response that we're trying to get out of this target. And this is now where you're getting to what you want to say. What is your communication objective? But what is it that you want them to say or to do? And another important part of this is not just what do you want them to say or what do you want them to do, what do you want them to feel? Often what people's feeling, what they feel about you, what they feel about what you said is as important as what they sort of intellectually respond. Like, is there some particular interest that you have to appeal to get the response that you want? What is that interest or desire? Is there certain incentives that you've got to offer? If you accept what I'm saying, here's the benefits. Just thinking around the response is a real key thing. And there's almost a moral dimension to this too that won't get into, but is the response that you're trying to get the right response by whatever criteria you define rightness? Are you trying to get people to do or say something that's questionable? Is what you're asking them to do the right thing to be asking them? Because if it isn't, that'll affect, they'll sniff that out quicker than anything else if you're asking them to do something that's why often arguments for strategic voting fall on deaf ears with the public. Like, I want you to vote for this guy that you don't really like, because if we get him, then it'll split the vote so that that guy can vote. Like, it sounds kind of squeezy, and usually it doesn't work, because ordinary folks don't tend to vote strategically, instinctively. So the response side is extremely important. What's the net impression you want to leave? And this is getting more to the emotional side. Like, what's the, again, more how do you want them to feel as distinct from what do you want them to say, what do you want them to do? And then given all of that, and see how far we've got down this list, we've got to 7 things before we've ever got to framing the message. But now we get to, okay, given that bunch and what I know about them on that day, or this audience, or that group, in competition with these messages, with the aim of trying to get this kind of response, what message fired into the brains of those people under these circumstances will produce the result that I want? We're getting to the message, but you see how the message is now shaped a lot more by just what I'm thinking, but it's shaped by this type of thing. And of course, so there's going to be more than one message. Like, is there a message where you got to identify who you are? They don't know who you are, suppose they don't. So there's something that you've got to acquaint them with. Are there some misconceptions in their head that you've got to knock out before you're going to get to the receptivity to your message? So what message do you communicate to knock out the preconceptions? Is there certain information they have to have, just pure information that they have to have in order to respond to what you're saying? You can break down these message components, but it's all shaped by what you did initially. And then, one way of, I've always found helpful in this is to, how would they explain what you are saying to them if they were explaining it to somebody else? Because that forces you to say it in their language, to put yourself in their shoes if they're communicating. And often you can find this out with small meetings or public meetings by actually asking people, like, you know, I've told you about this communication plan, but how would you explain this to your peers? And if they start doing it different, saying it different, you know that you should be saying it a little bit different. And one of the, again, there's sort of a moral dimension to communications. After you got all these messages, it doesn't hurt to ask yourself, is it true? And this is particularly true in the political arena, because half the messages are half-truths, near truths. And I think you want to be, if you want to be communicating with integrity, is it true? We once had a director of our question period, you would recognize his name, whose view of the question period was the object was to get on the evening news that night. And I used to have to haul him in every so often, and because he would write out the preamble to a question for me in the House of Commons. I say, this is excellent stuff. If I said this, we would be on the news tonight. There's only one thing wrong with it. It's not true. And he would say, I know, but if you said it, you'd get on the evening news. But is it true? Is it true? This is the same point. And then I've tended to focus on maybe the content of the message, what's the tone. And the tone will do as much to provoke an emotional reaction as the actual, like, are you to be positive and aggressive with this audience? Are you to be differential? Again, depending on who you're talking to. If you're a young person talking to a very experienced bunch of elders, you want to tend to be differential. You know, you probably all know a lot more about this than myself, but hopefully my perspective will be useful to you, that type of thing. If, on the other hand, there are other audiences where you want to be aggressive and positive, particularly when you're dealing with hostile audiences, to be positively confident, say, look, I know that a majority of you do not think this way, but I really do think that your consideration of these alternatives would be to your benefit. It would certainly be a benefit to me to hear what your objections are. You know, it's the tone as much as what you're also saying. And then this is one of the, to me, was one of the most important parts. I've always had a file of anecdotes, illustrations, pictures that can be used to carry the freight. And the speech writer or speech assistant that was most useful to me was the one that could come up with analogies that can carry the freight. And particularly the more it's into cross-cultural communication, the more these, that's what analogies are. This is like that. This is in my universe, the source. That is in your universe. An analogy is a bridge between a source and receiver. And the bigger the gap there is, the more important getting those bridges are. And you can pick up these anecdotes any time, way, shape. Just if you start thinking about this, you'll just see things. You may not even be preparing for a speech or anything, but you'll see something, and I always keep a file of analogy stories that can carry the freight. And one of the greatest sources of them is just talking to ordinary people who may try to translate what you're saying using an analogy. And one that I guess I've used around here, but it is true in was it the 2004 federal election that the sponsorship scandal was the issue? Was it 2004? I think
2006 as well.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm riding on the C train here in Calgary, and I used to start conversations on the C train when I represented Calgary Southwest, and then I'd get off the train and there'd be an argument going on in the train. But anyway, I'm sitting beside this fellow who he looked like he was a carpenter. He was covered with sawdust and he had a lunch bucket. And so I say to him, did you hear they've called a federal election today? And he said, yeah. He said, I heard about that. And I said, did some of these media guys say that sponsorship thing in Quebec, that's going to be a big issue? You or the boys heard about that? He said, yeah, I have heard about that. Guys were talking about it at lunch. And what do you think about that? And some of you have heard me say this, but he kind of looked at his shoes and he looked at the ceiling. By now, half the car is listening to this. He says, well, it's like there's something rotten in the fridge, he says. And we got to figure out whether it's the cheese or the sausage or whether we got to clean out the whole damn thing. Well, that night I had to give a talk on the election. It's like there's something rotten in the fridge. Like it's a great analogy. It's something that everybody can connect to. It's got this rotten aspect to it. It carries the freight. And the more complicated the thing that you're talking about, the more difficult it is to understand. This is like that. Analogies, they're just worth their weight in gold. And all your other reading and all your watching other media, if you kind of keep an eye out for analogies to what you're talking about, the better it can be. This is particularly important if you're a communications planner. This question might actually be asked a little bit earlier on in that. Given the message you want to communicate, who is the best spokesperson for it? Is it necessarily you? And in many cases, this is the disappointing thing for the political guy when your communication person says, it's not you. You're not the best one to be saying this. So can you, again, this is sort of if you're planning a campaign, like out of whose mouth would this, particularly an issue campaign, out of whose mouth would these messages be most credible? So thinking that through and trying to find a source that's credible so that you don't have to build credibility around somebody that isn't. One partial answer to this is if you're still the communicator, but you're not the most communicator, can you put your words sort of into the mouths of somebody else? one of the most famous speeches of this kind was given by Woodrow Wilson in his campaign. Remember, Wilson was president and he went crusading for the creation of the League of Nations, which was something that the American people didn't want to hear. So part of his core speech on this was, mothers who have lost their sons in France have come to me and have taken my hand and said, God bless you, Mr. President. I advised the Congress of the United States to create the situation which led to the deaths of their sons. Why then would they pray God to bless me? Because they believed that their boys died for something which vastly transcended the immediate and palpable objects of the war. They believed, they believed, they believed. And you see what the guy's doing. He's putting this message into the mouth of a more credible source. Mothers who had lost their sons in France. It's called transference. It's not, the best is to find the actual most credible source for your message, but if you can't do that, doing it that way, it was pretty effective. It was a pretty effective speech. I can remember it. So we're getting towards the end. How's the feedback to be generated, received, and interpreted? Like you want to get feedback. You want to get a response. So how do you get a response? Sometimes in public meetings, of course, having an open question period is one way of getting the response. You know, in a small meeting, you can actually ask, what do you think about this? You can get the response. In some of my public meetings, I had volunteers in the audience whose job at the end of the meeting was to ask people, what did you think of that? And trying to get that feedback. And particularly if you're on a speaking circuit where you're doing this night after night after night after night, you will start to modify how you say it, what you say, based on the feedback. They didn't understand this, they got the wrong impression from that, they misinterpreted that story. But the more you get feedback, not having feedback, you're flying blind. And you'll find speakers that on speaking circuits, if they're given exactly the same speech 5 nights in a row, and it's not modified at all by their experience, what they're telling you is they're not getting the feedback. They're not reading the feedback. And then this is actually the last one. I think if one does this sort of thing regularly, you'll start coming up with different kind of guidelines for dealing with competing sources, guidelines for approaching audiences and stuff like that. And when I was in the consulting business, we would prepare these for a variety of different people, different sources, and then after the session we'd think, did we learn anything here about how to do it better? Did we change the questions? The questionnaire actually got smarter by being experienced to people, by the experience of communicating with people. And if you keep using this, you'll probably change the questions to get, this is better to ask that, better to ask that, this isn't too useful, etc. So that's a planning framework for receiver-oriented communication, which, in my judgment, a democratic political person or someone assisting a democratic political person communicating would benefit from.